Welcome to DevOps, Why, How, and What. I'm Kelly Albrecht from Last Call Media, Agile and DevOps coach for the teams there and for the client teams that we're doing large projects for. I'm going to focus mostly on the why, some of the what, and a little bit of an introduction to thinking about the how. And the reason why I'm going to try to weight things that way is because there's a talk in the auditorium right after mine, which I think is going to do kind of the opposite of that. I think there's going to be, and you could bring your how questions to that talk, and Cyber SWAT from DDev would be a good place. So I don't want there to be too much overlap, so he and I have communicated a little bit. Okay. So the reason why I want to focus heavily on the why is because I think my hypothesis is that if you have a strong understanding of the why of the DevOps strategy, that's going to help you choose the right path on some of the how stuff and to set your goals on the right what you would expect if you were to go down that path. So I think the why kind of gets skipped over a lot of the times, especially if you're an organization that has been sold DevOps as a solution to your problems. That skips the why and just sells you the how with the promise of the what. And if you're missing the why, you could do it really wrong. Everything that we're going to talk about today can be thought about within these three buckets. Gene Kim, in several of his books, calls them the three ways of DevOps. I like to think of them as categories because some of the things that we'll talk about in DevOps could fit into a couple of these, but they are flow, feedback, and learning. And I'm going to try to remember to tie a lot of the stuff that we talk about back to each one of these. It's a nice way to kind of organize it in your brain, I think, to think about the different things that are happening along your DevOps journey. So why are people doing DevOps? There's a bunch of whys. I want to cover a few of them. There's the first one I want to cover is kind of an intuition why, which has its roots in lean and agile methodologies. DevOps ultimately grew out of that thinking and that way of thinking about how we work. And then I also have more statistical reasons why. So there are a number of drivers as to why you might do this, why you might get into this. So just going in and saying we need to do DevOps because we need flow, feedback, and learning isn't always convincing. So I want to touch on some of the more convincing stuff. The first one has a lot to do with flow, and then it also can be tied into a little bit of feedback toward the end of it. But one of the things that we ask in, say, Agile workshops or Agile assessments is you can ask an organization, is it safe and possible to release your work at any time? So if you think about that, you're doing some work and you think it's done and you give it to the customer anytime you think it's done. So that's something that I think the web development community takes for granted because a lot of us started where we had a server and our client needed us to do something. We just go on the server and we do it, and we essentially release that work at any time. But in larger organizations, this isn't always the case. So the last time I asked this question in a real workshop setting was down in GovCon, where most of the room were developers from big government agencies. And they thought this question was crazy. First, why would you want to release it at any time? Another question is, or another concern is, I'm not trusted to release my work at any time. Or I don't trust others to release their work at any time. Something might break. We need to, there's a lot more stuff that needs to happen after my work is done. So you can talk about each one of these current concerns and questions, like how do we improve trust on the team? How can we change our process? And you can kind of gets this feeling of like, well, maybe it is possible to release our work at any time. But then what happens eventually in the conversation is the people that you're talking about it with, who don't think it's possible, will bring up what they're stuck in. So if you imagine a room full of developers thinking it's crazy to think about their team releasing their work at any time, they're usually thinking that because done for them, they're all the way over to the left in this process. Some of the stuff in the middle is different between organization and other organizations. Most of us as web developers, we don't have to deal with this, but in larger organizations, this is how things have been divided up. The development team finishes its work, throws it over the wall for functional testing. So there's people that want to confirm that it's functioning the way it was intended. Then maybe performance testing after that. I think a lot of people might have a separate QA phase. And then finally, after it passes everything, then it gets bundled up by operations to put into operations on their servers and put into production and release to the customers. So what's happening here is an idea that was originally intended to delight customers gets put on development's plate to do, and eventually that batch of good stuff that the customers really want has to make its way through this whole process before being released to them maybe months later by an operations team. And so this is a big problem that a lot of us. Does anybody work somewhere where this is how it works? Over the wall operations does it, and people get sick of this. These walls between these phases have been referred to as walls of confusion. The big handoff. You batch up your work. You get a big batch of work. Each phase does their work very quickly, tries to do a really good job, and then they throw it over the wall. And if there's a problem over there, it's not their fault. And the people who receive the work, if they find a problem, they throw it back over the wall. It's not their fault. The mistake happened in development. Lots of finger pointing, lots of blame. Very frustrating, and it takes a really long time for the work to get from one end to the other. So what's happening here is that it's very intuitive if you try to think like, how are we going to get this work done in the most efficient way possible? It's very intuitive for people to think very individualistically, as if you just give me all the work, I'll be able to focus on it. Give me all the work, leave me alone, I'll be able to focus on it, do a really good job, get it done really fast, and pass all of it to someone else who can do the same. They can get all their work, we'll leave them alone, they'll get really fast, they'll do it really quickly and really well until it's done, and then they'll pass it on to the next group. So we can call this strategy batch it up and be the fastest at processing a batch. Okay? So people in the Agile and Lean communities know that that is absolutely not the fastest, most efficient way to work. And we can cover this, we can prove this with an exercise that everybody can do. Has anybody played the penny game? It's not exactly a game, but it's like a penny exercise. Awesome. All right, we're not going to play it because my experience is that people get it right away and then it's kind of boring to finish. So I'll just describe it really quickly. So the penny exercise, what we're going to do is we're going to have 20 pennies representing a batch of work. So this could be 20 great ideas that development is being asked to do and being asked to deliver them to the customer. And so delivering what the customer wants in this exercise is each penny to be flipped 4 times. Okay, so I'm a customer, I want 20 pennies, I want them to have been flipped 4 times, and we're going to put them on the development team's plate. They're going to flip each penny 1 time, and they're going to pass it on to functional testing, who is going to flip each of the 20 pennies 4 times, and then they're going to pass it on to performance testing, who's going to flip each penny 4 times. And so it'll look something like this. So flip each penny once, pass it on to the next phase, flip each penny once, pass it on to the next phase, until the penny has been flipped 4 times, with the 4th time being flipped by operations by that other team, and then delivered to the customer. So when you do the exercise this way, which essentially represents a batch of 20 moving through each of those 4 phases, the customer gets their 20 pennies, having been flipped 4 times, as a nice big release. They get their first penny and their last penny of the 20 pennies all at the same time. Very much like what happens in a development phase, operations phase. So the operations team might release something, I don't know. How often does, for you who has an operations team, how often do they release stuff?
Like usually once a month, actually.
Once a month, right? So the 20 pennies make their way through the phases, and then about once a month, operations bundles up the phases, crams it onto a production server. They probably clear their schedule because that much change could have some risks, so everything could go down. They want to make sure they can. There are stories of people having to stay up late to deal with the repercussions of releasing that much change at once, and that's how that works. That's what's represented here. When you do this exercise this way, 20 pennies at a time, it takes about 2 minutes for the pennies to make their way all the way from development to the customer flipped 4 times. So when you do the whole batch, the customer receives the whole batch, which means they receive their first and their last penny at the same time in about 2 minutes. Okay? But interestingly, if you do batches of 5, or if you do batches of 10, or you do batches of 5, each time you do a smaller batch, it gets faster and faster. Right? So if you flip 5 and pass, then flip 5 and pass, flip 5 and pass, faster and faster. If you do 1 penny at a time, and this is the exercise, right? You start with the whole batch, and then you break it down to what's the extreme version of 1 penny. And you flip 1 penny, pass, flip 1 penny, pass, flip 1 penny, pass. The customer gets the first penny in 4 or 5 seconds. So whereas before with 20 pennies, they got the first penny in 2 minutes, now they're getting a piece of value in 5 seconds. And then they get all 20 pennies in 30 seconds. So whereas before they got the first and last in 2 minutes, now they're getting the first in 5 seconds and the last of the 20 in 30 seconds. So a lot faster, just delivering value faster. So that's an intuitive way to talk about, let's break down our batches of work. Let's get, what we learned from this is break down our work into smaller pieces, and we can deliver more frequently. Yay. But what's happening here is when we're doing 1 penny at a time, flip that 1 penny, pass, flip that 1 penny, pass. What that means is that we have everyone on our team that we need to deliver work to the customer. This isn't that we're doing the whole batch and it's going and eventually it's going to operations to do all the work. We have, if we're flipping 1 penny at a time, that means we have the testing people, we have the operations people, we're all on the same team, and we all flip our pennies and deploy that penny. So we've got a smaller piece of work, and we've got everyone needed on the team to deploy that work, and that's how we can move and deliver 1 penny at a time, smaller pieces of work at a time, and deliver it much faster. And we'll see in some of the later examples that doing a smaller batch size is economically more sensible. So that's the intuitive way. So you might be on an organization where people realize it just makes sense to do smaller and to try to do as small of a batch as possible. And then if your organization agrees, let's try to do that, then what you get is trying to get all these people on the same team and working together and thinking about how can we do this. And so a lot of the DevOps stuff that we experience comes from trying to do that, trying to get everybody on the same team so that their definition of done can be putting value in a customer's hands. A lot of the stuff that we know from DevOps comes from those teams thinking about how are we going to make this easier. And so some of the challenges that come up is development it's always been the case that they want their work to flow to the customer. Their new work, their changes. They're being asked to do new exciting stuff and they're doing it, and they want that to get out to the customer. At the other end of it, the operations team, they just want their servers to stay up. They don't want anything to change. any little change that they have to put on their servers is a risk that something's going to go down and someone's going to get mad at them and they're going to have to stay up late, and they lose trust in the development team, and the development team loses trust in operations. They just both think each other is idiots, causing things. So operations thinks development causes things to go down. Development thinks operations doesn't know what they're doing. And so some of the things that have come out of this are this idea of having production and your development environment match. So that's going to make things more likely to work when it's time to deploy stuff. And maybe let's start doing automation. Let's get continuous integration. Let's start writing tests as we're developing. Let's shift the testing to the left. And so what happens with DevOps, when you start to try to figure out how do we all work on the same team, you get the operations concerns, what's called shifted to the left, working with development and getting them done sooner. Okay? So the definition of done starts including all of the testing, then the development, and it starts including deploying to production. So a lot of the stuff that we know about DevOps comes from trying to be able to all work on the same team and deliver straight to the customer. So people are studying this, and a lot of people go to this study. Oh, right. So just to touch on one more thing. So development wants things to flow out to the customer, and operations wants things to be safe and stable. All right? And so those two concepts are important to teams that are trying to deliver more value to their customers more frequently and faster. So flow and safety. And so a lot of people look to a study done by Dr. Ronald Westrum, who's I think a social scientist. And Westrum, so independent of DevOps, Westrum is known for studying, he was very interested in why some hospitals and airlines were much safer than other hospitals and airlines. So he's thinking, what are these safe hospitals and airlines doing right that the other ones can learn from? And so he studied them and found some very, very, very strong correlations. And so the hospitals that were the most safe and the airlines that were the most safe had what Westrum calls a generative culture. And a generative culture is, he found, can be designated by the following, the traits up here on the board. High cooperation, messengers are trained, risks are shared, bridging is encouraged between teams, any failure leads to inquiry and learning. Failures are seen as opportunities to learn. New things are implemented. So the safest hospitals and airlines had these traits. The messenger trained one, I think, is just kind of not always obvious. If we go to this next slide, where this is his breakdown, the correlations he found, he broke down into these categories, and you can see in the pathological culture on the left, the messenger is shot. In the middle, neglected, but in the generative culture, the messenger is trained. And so this would be this idea that the phrase is "don't shoot the messenger." So this is somebody who's actually showing a high level of accountability and seeing problems and bringing them up, raising them. And you want to take care of that person and train that person to be effective, because you need accountability is very important. Self-organizing accountability is very important, and that's what you see on the generative teams. So you have all these concepts, all of the traits of the generative team leads to safety and better information flow, which are highly desirable on any team that is trying to achieve flow and safety. And so it's been a very good fit. And so it's no surprise that I think I wanted to go to this slide. So then it's no surprise that people who are studying DevOps, this is Nicole Forsgren and Jez Humble. This is information from a recent book by them, Accelerate, but you can also find it in the DevOps Handbook by Jez and Jean Kim. They found through several surveys over a period of time on the state of DevOps that high-performing IT organizations strongly correlate to the generative cultures as identified by Westrom. So it's no surprise that if you have one of these generative cultures, if you're working in that way, your work is going to flow better, your information will flow better, and your releases will be safer and stable. So that's something interesting to think about. They also found a high a correlation between high-performing IT organizations as being twice as likely to exceed profitability. We'll touch on that in the next slide. Interestingly, they achieve higher levels of throughput and stability. So that ties back to what Westrom found at the hospitals and the airlines, which would be that a generative culture is both information flows better and is safer. So you get, on a DevOps team, you get the throughput and the stability. And since there's better stability, these high-performing teams are able to spend much more time on new work and less on rework. So they're able to focus more on the features that they're building. So, and also from all of this, IT performance is predictive of the performance of the organization as a whole. So organizations, high-performing organizations with high-performing IT and DevOps teams are going to be more successful, and we'll talk about that in another slide too. High performers are defined by a deployment frequency of essentially on demand, at least multiple times per day. Their lead time for changes that they want to make are less than an hour. If they have a failure, they recover in less than an hour, and any change that they make leads to less than 15% of them lead to failures. So it's pretty high-performing teams, and this is like, well, duh, if we have an awesome high-performing team, it's going to be awesome, but it's interesting to think about what exactly the specifics of all that is to be a high-performing team. Let me see, kind of jumbled up this slide a little bit. Okay. So we're not going to dig into this slide, I just show it to you because if you dig further into this, you will find information like this. This is data and numbers from Dr. David Rico. And if you look up Dr. David Rico, he has a lot that he's written trying to explain this. This is his color scheme. But essentially what he's saying on this slide, which is really interesting to think about, is that if you go from this line right here in the vertical middle is software inspection. So this is kind of the manual way that you might develop a feature and inspect it and look for bugs. And so he has a cost of achieving quality at this row here, but then he points out that if you essentially automate things and set up monitoring and essentially through automation get your quality for free, he calculates that out to a 73,000% return on investment, which just seems unbelievable. So it's, you might want to dig into it. He's written a lot about it. I like to think about this in the next slide, which I think is a little more intuitive, which is a graph by Donald Reinertsen. You can find a lot of pages about this in his book, The Principles of Product Development Flow. And what he's talking about here is the economy of batch size, given essentially a calculation of what it costs to release that batch in relationship to the holding cost, or what you could consider a cost of delay, and calculating what would your optimal batch size be from an economics perspective. So to explain this, I like to think about maybe buying eggs. Okay, so if I live 10 miles away from the grocery store and I buy one egg at a time, so this is your batch size, so if we're going to talk about eggs, we could have one egg here on the left and a dozen eggs over on the right. And if I were going to buy eggs at a batch size of one egg, I drive 10 miles to the store, and then I drive home. That's my transaction cost for one egg. If I want to buy a dozen eggs, because living 10 miles away from the store is not super close, I drive to the store and I buy 12 eggs. So I get 12 in that one trip. So my transaction cost, I think, is essentially the effort to go there divided by 12. So transaction cost is much lower. The overall cost is calculated by adding the transaction cost to the holding cost. That's your overall cost. Your holding cost in this egg example could be your refrigerator space and the fact that eggs go bad eventually. So there's this, the longer you wait, the more holding costs you have. You're holding on to these eggs, or if you delay eating them, some could go bad, that kind of thing. In a software development world, you would include opportunity loss costs in this calculation. This is kind of more of a fuzzy one to calculate, but it's conceptual. This whole thing's conceptual, I think. So really what this is doing is, depending on how far away you are from the store, what it costs for your cost of delay and your holding costs, you can calculate how many eggs you want to buy at a time. If you lived right upstairs from the store and all you had to do was walk down the stairs, maybe you get one of those little six eggs packs, and so your eggs are always fresh. But if you live 30 minutes from the store, you're probably going to buy a dozen eggs because it's more effort to go down. You don't have to just walk down the stairs. So that's the thought there. So it makes economic sense to figure out what your batch size is. But then also what this further explains is if you find a way to drop your transaction cost down to maybe zero through automation, like we saw in David Rico's table of calculations, if you can lower this down so that it essentially costs you nothing to release your thing, your overall cost is both going to drop down and to the left, and that's going to scoot your optimal batch size over and to the left. And what you essentially achieve is getting further away from doing 20 pennies at a time from that exercise we talked about, and closer to doing 1 penny at a time. And so the companies that have been able to drop their transaction costs down to next to zero would be companies like Amazon or Google or Netflix. All these companies that are able, since they have thousands of people doing thousands of little changes and features, they're able to release software thousands of times per day. And that's why they're winning in the marketplace, so to speak. They're able to move very quickly, make very small changes very, very fast, and they're able to take advantage of that flow that we saw in the penny game. By reducing our batch size to be very small, we achieve a greater flow. And a lot of things get a lot easier at a smaller batch size. Smaller tasks are easier to communicate about, they're easier to commit to, they're easier to test, they're easier to know when they're done. The smaller you can make the tasks, the less variability there is in them, the less risk there is in them. Everything gets better the smaller that your batch gets. And well, you want it to be optimal batch size. In this example, it could be too small, but transaction cost plays a big role in that. And so that's why, from an economics perspective, there's major advantages in being a high-performing DevOps team, both in your teamwork and cooperative nature of being able to communicate and do smaller pieces of work at a time, but also in the return on investment that you get from releasing smaller pieces of work more frequently. See, I messed up my slides. All right. So we talked about an intuition-based flow with the penny game. We talked about flow with the optimal batch size. We talked about feedback in the form of building testing into the features you're developing. You're getting the feedback from the testing that's happening on your local machine. You're getting the feedback that's happening when you push your changes up to be merged in with the others on your team. Continuous integration is an innovation that runs when that happens and runs the automated testing, so you're getting your feedback there. There's also the sense in which you want your feedback just in an agile and iterative sense, where you want to be getting these things on what some DevOps companies would call a preview environment. Pantheon has a multi-dev. I forget what Acquia calls theirs, but getting that feedback from your functional testers so that they can see the thing sooner, maybe even see the thing while the code is still, while the files are still open on the developer's machines, and a change or a fix would be very easy. Essentially just maybe the penny, you flipped it the wrong way, you just need to flip it again, and you can solve things right there. And we haven't touched so much on learning, but the learning is a very important aspect of DevOps. You want to be working with your teams. You want to see that, to tie it back into Westrom's wording of this, generative cultures, failure leads to inquiry. So how can we create a culture of continuous experimentation and continuous learning, leading to innovation and improving the process? It's actually the learning bucket or way of DevOps that has led to the things that we know DevOps to be today with all the automation. There was a lot of learning about what was important to everyone on the team, what was important to be part of the definition of done for each feature, and where can we innovate, what can we try, and it needs to be a part of any DevOps culture moving forward. Let's see, what do I have here? All right. So how do we start, and what will we see? I think the first thing that's important for starting is to work on the team's culture of failure leading to inquiry and learning, and because you have a lot of smart people on your team. If you get your dev team and your operations team to stop blaming each other and actually get on the same side of the problems and start to talk about how might they make things more stable, how might they make things flow faster from to do to done, they have the answers. They need to know that it's okay to try some things and to think about what would be a safe way to experiment on how to start. You might have a consultant come in to get you started, but I haven't really noticed where that's the case. The programmers and the operations people on the team, they know their stuff. They just need to know that they can start working together. So let's see, what do I have? Okay, all right, so at this point, I think for the rest of the time, let me see, I think, was it 10, we got 9 more minutes? Okay, so I think for the rest of the time, I'm gonna jump into the in-progress results from this, just to show you a little bit what that looks like, but also to tie it into the learning way of DevOps and how you might use this approach to get started on DevOps, because it essentially starts with an assessment of your team. So you want an understanding of what would the specific goals of a DevOps organization be, and you assess how you're doing in each one of those things. And for the ones that that you're not doing at all or not doing very much, you want to start to think about how might we start doing this thing. And for the ones that you started, you want to think about how might we improve. And for the ones that you're doing really great at, you want to think about how can we sustain or double down on our success on this dimension of our DevOps journey. Okay, so anybody have any thoughts from any of that so far? Any questions? How are we doing? Is any of this interesting? Thumbs up, feedback from the audience.
What's a good learning path for DevOps?
Oh, good learning path for DevOps. I would read. I had been recommending Accelerate, but then I got through the DevOps Handbook. The DevOps Handbook is about 3 times as many pages as Accelerate, but I think it's a much better book. It's a little slower to get started. Accelerate feels a little more hand-wavy, Accelerate might be something that you try to get your boss to read. It really focuses on their findings from their surveys and really justifying them as scientific and helping the reader understand. There are a lot of correlations, but there are also a lot of predictions, and it's important if you want to know the data behind why DevOps works. It's important to know the difference between correlation and prediction, and also to see what they say predicts what is important. But in terms of how to get started, I think the DevOps handbook is probably something that I recommend. Did you have something?
No.
Okay.
Did you bring us back to that slide with the different kinds of groups? As like 3 columns?
Like this one?
No, I think it's
The generative.
Yeah.
that one, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so you might be in a place that feels pathological, or maybe you escaped from one in your past, the past in your career.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no.
The learning path question. So I work for Drupalcamp, and we get a lot of requests for DevOps tutorials. And besides like learning automation, or like what other types of skills and kind of areas of study do you think people are looking for when they want to learn DevOps?
Well, I think it's really important to have a strong background in agile practices and lean thinking. Just to be thinking about. I think it's really intuitive, and I see this on a lot of teams where they want to commit to the big task and disappear for 2 weeks. You might be doing sprints, and people on the team, they just want to take that whole thing, and then every stand-up it's like, oh, I'm still working on it.
Okay.
I'm still working on it.
So it's a part of it is a way of thinking in the process.
Yeah. Well, so like you need to have those people on the teams believe in the value of breaking down the work.
Okay.
And so it can be a situation where, if you're on a team that has a long ways to go, they kind of have like layers and layers of stuff, of issues built up where they don't feel safe. There might be a respect issue, like they want to hide away with their stuff because they don't want to show it in progress because they're afraid someone's going to think they're stupid, or there's a lot of stuff to try to unpack and get in there. And so there's not really a silver bullet to it because everybody's a little bit different, and you could have everybody on your team could be working on a little bit of a different aspect of that layer of stuff. So yeah, I think a strong. So aside from the automated testing, or aside from just writing tests, writing testable code, I think one of the things that gets skipped over is the conceptual understanding of what we're all trying to do.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I think going from I think a lot of people, maybe a lot of organizations are most comfortable in bureaucratic, and the idea of going to generative could just feel like going to anarchy. And it's and a lot of organizations are on some sort of digital transformation to try to get from bureaucratic to generative, and it's very tricky. If you've been in a very old organization where people get really good at the bureaucratic column. They feel safe in their lane. They know how to stay in that lane. They know how to not get blamed for stuff. They know how to blame everybody knows how to pass the blame around, and you feel like you have a good day when you survive a bureaucratic day. So it's the tricky thing is that agile and lean thinking, just to say that's easier said than done. That's also another thing that gets sold as a silver bullet solution.
Mm-hmm.
And so like one of the things that the Scaled Agile framework gets picked on for is it's really just trying to be a framework within a generative culture can grow and people can flexibly find their way. But what happens is it covers so much stuff for the enterprise that it gets very easily manipulated back into a new bureaucracy. If you've ever seen the Scaled Agile framework poster, it's like, it's hard to even, it could be a puzzle that you put together. It's so big and complicated. But it's really just that you're trying to do really important work within a very big and complicated system. So there's a lot to talk about of a way, if you had to try it one way, you might as well try it this way. But it gets easily converted back into bureaucratic when it becomes rule-oriented.
So part of like, if someone who was, trying to seek a job, like, okay, I want to get a job in DevOps, right? Is understanding what a healthy generative culture looks like and what the values are associated with that, so that when they're in an interview or when they're starting a job or have an internship, they can recognize the signs of like, this is a place I want to be versus this is a place that's going to stress me out and is not going to be good for me in the long run.
Yeah. If you recognize that you're interviewing for a pathological or bureaucratic organization, I would only continue going there if you thought that you could be the one to bring influence it to be more generative. Otherwise, you're going to be very constricted and frustrated, and you're not going to be listened to. And you say like, hey, I know all this stuff about smaller batch size and testing, and you might get told, testing's not worth the investment. Just get the feature out. But you know that if you start building, you take the time to build the testing in, the features are going to go out much faster in the end. Yeah. So, let's see. So these are the most recent results of this DevOps survey that we've got open. Oh, it went up a little bit. It was at 66. Score doesn't mean anything. All the score, the way that I think about this is a tool that we made called Measure Team, and all it is a way to put in statements that you want to be good at and you want to improve at over time, so that you can periodically self-assess on your consistency at those statements. And it's meant to be a way to generate ideas from the team for how could we improve at this statement. And then when you get to the survey actually looks like this. Right, so here's a statement: version control is used for all artifacts. That's consistent for my team. And maybe if it wasn't consistent at all, we might try moving our code to GitHub or something. And what happens is when you get to the end of the survey, the things that need the most focus are at the top, with whatever ideas the team has come up with for a way to improve, and you might generate some action items out of that. People aren't really adding the ideas to this, because I don't think the UX is there to make it clear enough how that works, because we just made this and we're testing it on everybody. But the idea would be not so much that it's a 67 or what is this, a D plus in grade school. The idea is that the next time you take it, you want to try to have it be a 68, and the next time you take it, you want it to be a 69 or a 70 or 71, and that's the idea of continuous learning and continuous improvement, which is a huge part of DevOps. It's more in a continuous improvement strategy. It's less important how good or bad things are today, only that they're a little bit better than yesterday, and that there's an effort to make them a little bit better tomorrow. So you just continuously improve. And so for all of the Drupal people that we've asked to put their input in, right now the focus area that's surfaced to the top is the majority of primary business value has test coverage, and these tests are to be run whenever code is committed. So right on cue, John Pugh has a session tomorrow on writing BHAT tests. Test-driven development. Yep, practices. So this is currently a top focus area, or area needing focus in the Drupal community, which is essentially building the tests into the development process and getting them to be run whenever you merge that code back in. So who here is writing tests as their... Some people recommend that you write the test first, That's the recommended way. I think in reality, sometimes it makes sense to do it kind of at the same time. John, do you always write your tests first? Yeah.
As you go.
Yeah, you kind of have to like figure out the way you're. Yeah, but the value, I think the biggest. Huh?
It depends, I guess.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It definitely depends. But if you want to get to this and participate in this, it's this URL, lcm.io/2019 Drupal DevOps, all one word. You could impact the score today. So in terms of, so this is a flow and feedback item. It's feedback in the sense that you're getting the feedback on whether or not your code is working as early as possible, which is going to help it flow right out to the customer, because it's going to be a known working piece of business value that's been tested on your machine, tested on the continuous integration environment, tested when it moved from the development to staging environment, which all of those match production, and tested when it's moved to production, and working when it moves to production. So ways to start doing this is to start to, one of the ways to start is just to value or to be champions of the value of writing testable code and including the tests, and taking the time to write the tests and taking the time to have tests on running on continuous integration. So this might be seen as a little bit of technical debt on any project, but you can figure out how to do it. There's a lot of information online, and there are a lot of services out there right now. We use Circle CI, but there are also more. Hey John, what is Open Dev Shop? What's doing testing like on Open Dev Shop? Huh?
Super simple.
Super simple.
It just runs out of the box. You have to write YAML files.
Yep.
Name differentiator.
Cool. Yeah.
It hosts the site and tests the site on the same server.
Right.
So you don't have to worry about which environment you're testing. You're running Circle against Pantheon, or it's just the Drupal site's there. All the workflows built in.
Yep.
For cloning environments and stuff.
So using a tool like surveying your team on these dimensions, and asking your team what would our next step be to try to get to try to be more consistent on this, you can really generate a lot of ideas and really find your way as a team. And there's most of these are solved problems, and they're out there. You just need to know that what's important for your team. Next one down is branches live for less than a day before being merged. This is a big flow item. So what this is that when you're doing work on your branch, and other people are doing work on their branches, you want to be merging this stuff in often, getting their changes, them getting your changes, and you also don't want to disappear with a feature that's going to take so long that things diverge and things gain more variability in what you're doing. So this one is working on smaller pieces and checking it back in with your team, checking it into the continuous integration environment, getting that feedback on how it's working with everybody else's work. There's a little bit of content on this one. How are people doing on when you branch your code out? How long do you keep it on that? Any developers? Who's on the development team in the room? Okay. Well, you want to make sure that your team understands that it's important to break that work down into small pieces, and that they check it in with each other frequently. That's a good one. That's an area of focus for the Drupal community. If anybody has any more questions about any of this, my plan was just to run through these till we ran out of time, but
I think the session ends at
In, like,
10:30.
oh, it ended 8 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Oh,
So I think you're good.
all right. Well, if there's any more questions, I landed the plane and then I kept driving to the end.
People walking out.
Oh, okay.
There's 30 minutes in between the sessions.
Yeah.
You're good.
Oh, okay. All right. I got confused on the time. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.